We've had reports of unusual activity in this area. Can you confirm any meetings? Nothing there. We need to secure this area. The cattle are getting too close to the road. I'll call for backup to manage the herd. Stay here and keep that flag visible. What do you think we should do about the cattle?
We need to clear the road safely. I'll call for backup.
The ranch had existed long before the subdivision sprouted up like a weed at its borders. Acres of open land, barbed wire fences weathered by decades of sun, and a deed that traced back farther than most of the homeowners now arguing about community standards. It was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that settled over livestock and dust roads before the heat rose. That calm didn't last. The problem arrived on polished tires, guided by entitlement and a clipboard. The HOA president, self-appointed, self-important, and infamous in the county, had been escalating her campaign for weeks. First came the letters slipped into mailboxes, printed on heavy paper with threatening language about compliance, land use violations, and future community development. Then came the survey flags along the ranch fence line, placed without permission, marking territory that was never hers to claim. Finally, there came the personal intrusion. She treated the ranch like an inconvenience, an obstacle standing between her son and what she believed he deserved. In her mind, the land was wasted on cattle and open sky when it could be transformed into something profitable, something modern, something that carried her family name on a sign at the entrance. The fact that the ranch owner had never agreed to sell, never attended HOA meetings, and never acknowledged her authority only fueled her obsession. The HOA board backed her publicly, even as several members privately questioned the legality of her actions. Complaints were filed anyway. County offices were flooded with emails alleging zoning violations that didn't exist. Anonymous tips were sent to code enforcement. The goal was pressure, attrition, and eventual surrender. It was a familiar tactic in property disputes like this, one that relied on intimidation rather than law. When those efforts failed, escalation followed. A call was made to emergency services, framed as a trespass issue, framed as a safety concern, framed carefully enough to sound legitimate. The expectation was simple. Uniforms would arrive, authority would be asserted, and the ranch owner would be forced off the land, at least temporarily. That window of opportunity was all she believed she needed. What she did not understand, what she never bothered to verify, was who actually owned the land, who enforced the law in this county, and how badly she had miscalculated the balance of power. The ranch was not unprotected. The quiet figure she had dismissed as an obstacle was deeply embedded in the very system she was attempting to weaponize. As dust rose on the road and official vehicles began moving toward the ranch, the situation teetered on the edge of becoming something much bigger than a property dispute. The lines were drawn, the paperwork was ready, and the consequences of unchecked arrogance were about to come into full view, setting the stage for a confrontation that would ripple far beyond the fence line. The call to emergency services traveled fast, carried on a narrative carefully shaped to trigger a response. It described an uncooperative land occupant, a hostile presence, and a property dispute framed as an immediate concern. In the mind of the HOA president, this was a masterstroke. Law enforcement would arrive, confirm her version of events, and force compliance where letters and threats had failed. She had used the system before, and it had always bent in her favor. County vehicles rolled down the dirt road toward the ranch, tires crunching gravel that had not been disturbed in hours. The sight alone seemed to validate her confidence. From a distance, it looked like victory approaching, like proof that her authority extended far beyond the manicured lawns of the subdivision. She stood near the fence line, posture rigid, already rehearsing the story she would tell, already envisioning the outcome. What she failed to consider was that the system she relied on was not blind. It remembered records, titles, and jurisdiction. It recognized land boundaries not by OA maps, but by county deeds and state filings. The ranch stood exactly where it was supposed to be, untouched by subdivision bylaws or community covenants. It was not subject to architectural review committees or future development plans drafted in living rooms and approved by applause. The responding deputies were not outsiders unfamiliar with the land. They knew the ranch, they knew its history, they knew its owner, and they knew the growing pattern of complaints coming from the HOA, complaints that consistently dissolved under even minimal scrutiny. The radio chatter shifted tone as information was confirmed, as names were checked, and as realization began to settle in. The HOA president watched from behind her sunglasses, mistaking calm professionalism for agreement. Every moment that passed without immediate action only hardened her belief that she was right. In her mind, delay meant procedure, and procedure meant enforcement was inevitable. She paced the fence line, gesturing toward survey flags and property markers she had installed without permission, certain they would be treated as evidence rather than trespass. Meanwhile, the ranch remained unmoved. Cattle grazed undisturbed. Gates stayed closed. The land did not acknowledge the manufactured urgency imposed upon it, and within that stillness was a presence far more consequential than the HOA had anticipated. A presence that carried not just ownership, but authority rooted in law, not assumption. As vehicles came to a stop and doors opened, the confrontation shifted from theoretical to real. The story she had constructed was about to be tested against facts she had ignored. The imbalance between perceived power and actual authority was about to become impossible to deny, and the next steps would determine whether this dispute ended quietly or exploded into a public reckoning she could no longer control. The stage was set, and the illusion of control was already beginning to crack. The presence of law enforcement at the ranch did not unfold the way the HO president had imagined. There was no immediate removal, no raised voices ordering compliance, no dramatic confirmation of her claims. Instead, there was procedure, methodical, unhurried, and rooted in documentation rather than emotion. That alone unsettled her. Authority, when it failed to perform on command, suddenly felt distant. The deputies moved with familiarity, scanning fence lines and survey markers with the practiced eye of people who had seen countless disputes fueled by entitlement. The flags placed by the HOA were quickly recognized for what they were: unauthorized, unofficial, and legally meaningless. Notes were taken not about the ranch's alleged violations, but about the actions taken by those who did not own the land. The shift in attention was subtle but unmistakable. The HOA president continued to assert her version of events, mentally cataloging every grievance she believed justified her actions. To her, the ranch was a blight, an obstacle, and a resource being unfairly withheld. She had convinced herself that proximity to the subdivision somehow transferred control, that growth demanded sacrifice, and that resistance was unreasonable. Those assumptions, once unchallenged within HOA meetings, now collapsed under the weight of actual law. Records were checked. Deeds were confirmed. Jurisdiction was clarified. Each step reinforced the same conclusion: the ranch stood outside HOA authority, and the complaints filed against it lacked merit. Worse still, the pattern of harassment began to take shape. Multiple reports, repeated claims dismissed by county offices, and now a misuse of emergency services. The dots connected themselves. The realization did not arrive all at once. It crept in through pauses, through exchanged glances, through the absence of validation she had expected. Her confidence faltered, replaced by irritation and disbelief. She had not planned for scrutiny of her actions. She had not planned for consequences. In her mind, she was enforcing standards, not crossing lines. What she still did not know, what hovered just beyond her awareness, was how deeply she had misjudged the ranch owner. This was not a private citizen easily bullied by bureaucratic noise. This was someone who understood the system from the inside, someone who had watched people, like her, attempt to weaponize authority before, and someone uniquely positioned to respond. As the deputies concluded their assessment, the atmosphere shifted again. What began as a complaint now resembled an investigation. The story was no longer about an uncooperative landowner, but about an HOA leadership pushing boundaries it did not own. The truth, once uncovered, had a momentum of its own. And with that momentum came the inevitability of exposure, setting the stage for a revelation that would turn embarrassment into something far more permanent. The moment of revelation did not arrive with theatrics. There was no dramatic announcement, no crowd, no raised voice claiming authority. Instead, it emerged through paperwork, through quiet acknowledgement, and through the subtle but unmistakable shift in how every uniformed presence on the property carried themselves. The ranch owner was no longer just a name on a deed. He was a name on their chain of command. What the HOA president had mistaken for indifference was restraint. What she had interpreted as delay was verification. And now, with confirmation complete, the atmosphere hardened into something she could not charm, bully, or outmaneuver. The man she had spent weeks attempting to displace was not merely protected by the law. He was one of its highest local stewards. The sheriff of the county did not answer to HOA's boards or development plans sketched out over catered lunches. The realization hit her sideways. Everything she had done suddenly recontextualized itself. The letters, the false complaints, the emergency call framed as a safety issue. None of it disappeared just because she hadn't known who she was targeting. Ignorance offered no shield here. If anything, it amplified the severity of her actions. The system she tried to exploit had a long memory and very little patience for misuse. The deputy's posture changed not into deference but into clarity. Lines were now sharply drawn. The unauthorized survey markers were documented as trespass. The repeated complaints were logged as harassment. The 911 call, intended as a power move, became the most serious misstep of all. Emergency services were not a tool for settling property grudges, and the consequences for abusing them were explicit. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They unfolded methodically, just like the investigation that triggered them. What happened at the ranch did not stay at the ranch. Reports moved through official channels, documented in systems the HOA president had never considered while drafting her threats and making her calls. The incident became part of a broader pattern, one that could no longer be dismissed as overzealous community management. County offices revisited prior complaints tied to the HOA, cross-referencing dates, language, and outcomes. What once looked like isolated concerns now appeared coordinated and persistent. The misuse of emergency services stood out sharply, not as a misunderstanding but as escalation. Each false claim had consumed time, resources, and attention that should have been reserved for real emergencies. That reality carried weight. Within the subdivision, whispers began before formal notices arrived. Board members who had previously nodded along to aggressive tactics now distanced themselves, suddenly aware of personal liability. The authority of the HOA president weakened as quickly as it had once felt absolute. Emails went unanswered. Support thinned. Silence replaced certainty. Her son's involvement, once framed as a future benefit to the community, became an uncomfortable focal point. What had been described as development now resembled entitlement. The land grab narrative collapsed under scrutiny, exposing personal interest masquerading as governance. Residents began asking questions that had been discouraged before about finances, about decision-making, about whether the HOA existed to serve the community or a single family. The ranch owner, now fully acknowledged in his professional role, did not pursue spectacle. There were no press statements, no grandstanding. The process moved forward because it had to, not because he demanded attention. That restraint only amplified the contrast between lawful authority and manufactured power. The HOA president found herself isolated, her influence reduced to a title that no longer commanded obedience. The same system she had relied on to intimidate now constrained her. Legal language replaced bluster. Compliance notices flowed in the opposite direction. The illusion of control she once wielded fractured under accountability. And yet, even as consequences mounted, denial lingered. She clung to the belief that this could still be reversed, that some technicality or connection would restore her standing. But the groundwork had already been laid. The records were filed. The narrative was set. As the community braced for what came next, one thing became clear: this was no longer just a property dispute. It was a reckoning, and its final chapter would determine whether the damage stopped at embarrassment or extended into something far more lasting. By the time the final determinations were made, the outcome felt inevitable. The investigation concluded not with drama, but with documentation. Formal findings that outlined misuse of authority, harassment, and abuse of emergency resources. Each conclusion rested on evidence, not emotion, and together they formed a record that could not be argued away in HOA meetings or buried in committee notes. The HOA president's removal was procedural, almost anticlimactic. A vote triggered by bylaws she had once wielded against others stripped her of the position she believed untouchable. The same rules she used to intimidate now enforced accountability. Her name was removed from letterheads. Her access to HOA systems was revoked. What remained was a paper trail and a community grappling with the aftermath of unchecked power. The subdivision itself changed. Residents became more engaged, more cautious about who they entrusted with authority. New leadership adopted transparency as a corrective measure, openly acknowledging mistakes that had been ignored for too long. The culture of quiet compliance fractured, replaced by a sharper awareness of rights, limits, and responsibility. The ranch stood unchanged, a silent witness to the ordeal. Its boundaries remained where they had always been, reaffirmed not by confrontation, but by law. The land did not need defending anymore. The system had done what it was designed to do when allowed to function without interference. For the sheriff, the episode served as another reminder of why restraint mattered. Authority did not need to announce itself loudly to be effective. It only needed to be exercised correctly. The situation resolved without retaliation, without spectacle, and without compromise of principle. That outcome carried more weight than any public shaming ever could. The former HOA president faded from prominence, her influence reduced to cautionary mention. Her attempt to control land she did not own became a lesson repeated in conversations and training sessions alike, a reminder that power assumed without jurisdiction is fragile, and that systems built on law do not bend to entitlement. In the end, the lines were clear. Property rights, legal authority, and community governance each had boundaries that could not be crossed without consequence. What began as an attempt to take had ended in loss, not of land, but of trust and standing. And as the dust settled over the ranch road once more, the quiet returned, not as ignorance, but as resolution, closing the final chapter of a dispute that would not soon be forgotten. The HOA president's sense of control evaporated. The authority she wielded within her gated community meant nothing here, on land governed by county, state, and federal law. Her son's aspirations, once treated as justification, now looked like motive. The narrative she had constructed unraveled, replaced by one she could not edit or spin. Around them, the ranch remained unchanged. The land did not care who stood on either side of the fence, but the people involved would feel the impact long after the dust settled. What began as a push for control had become a lesson in jurisdiction, power, and accountability. As vehicles prepared to leave and reports were finalized, the situation was no longer about removal. It was about record, about precedent, about what happens when private authority forgets its limits. And as the HOA president stood at the fence line she never owned, the weight of that realization settled in, heavy and unavoidable, carrying the promise that this was far from over.